power cuts lasting 2 to 4 hours.
And residents have not had running water for 7 weeks.
What is the ANC doing for us? Nothing.
Can you give us a date?
No.
Corruption.
So overcrowded in the classrooms.
Will I ever get a job?
The impact of grey listing.
The country that we have structured since 1994 is designed for this to happen.
Hi there, welcome back to Reality Check with me, Ben Cashdan in Johannesburg and Redi Tlhabi in Washington, DC. We're back after Easter and Ramadan and all that jazz, and we're very glad to be back with you. It is still the election season in South Africa, and we thought it would be a good idea to delve into the antics of the political parties. There are lots of people who would be our president here in South Africa. As far as I know, Redi, Cyril still wants to be our president. He wanted to resign briefly for a moment there when they found the cash in the mattress, but some people close to him, you were telling me, persuaded him not to resign.
Yeah, at that time, that's what I heard. I don't know if it's true, but I can believe it because sometimes he comes across as if he's not interested in the job. I think now he's energized because of the election, but there was a time where you'd look at him and say, this guy looks tired, and does he really want to do this?
You know, and he had one trick up his sleeve when we were watching the SONA, the State of the Nation, in February. And I was sort of half asleep on my couch watching the SONA, and, you know, it was the usual protocols and formalities. And then there was mention of this young woman who had benefited, and her name was Tinswalo. And I woke up from the couch briefly with my family, and we were all looking for Tinswalo in the audience. Where's this Tinswalo who had, been born as democracy's child and benefited from so many post-apartheid policies? But you weren't tricked by that, Redi. You knew that was a fictional Tinswalo dreamt up by male politicians who would be president. They've done it before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone who lives in South Africa and has lived in South Africa over all these years would actually think there is such a character. And in fact, Ben, what I did at the time was to go on social media and find an image of a skeleton, a skeleton that looked to be female, and the skeleton was like just falling down, and I say, there's Tinswalo. That's Tinswalo.
Now, the president said that Tinswalo had benefited from all sorts of programs. Let me read a tiny little bit of what he said. I think I can read it quicker than he said it. He said that Tinswalo was born in the dawn of freedom in 94, grew up in a society worlds apart from South Africa of her parents, beneficiaries of the policies of the democratic state, in a house provided by the state, one of millions of houses built for the poor, grew up in a household provided with water and electricity, enrolled in a school in which her parents did not have to pay school fees, and because of all of that, and had a full stomach from the school feeding scheme, because of all of that support, Tinswalo graduated and became a successful and presumably prosperous South African. And one thing that was so frustrating about this story that Cyril was telling is it's true. It's not untrue. People took to social media afterwards and said, particularly opposition party, leaders and supporters, and said, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as Tinswalo. Of course, there is such thing as Tinswalo. There are Tinswalos out there. And then, various Tinswalos started posting, hey, Redi, what our former producer, a few other folks said, actually, I think I am a Tinswalo. So Cyril might be right. So we thought in this, moment close to the elections where it really matters that we evaluate the ANC's promises, we ask the right question. And we've brought two economists, and later we'll be joined by the former head of Stats SA, Pali Lehohla. But before that, we're joined by two progressive economists, both of whom were in the trade unions, but both of whom are economists these days, Phelisa Nkomo, who is currently with Oxfam, and Khwezi Mabasa, who has been working for quite a bit of time with COSATU, the trade unions, and is currently at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Johannesburg. And we want to ask a question. And the opening question is this. If Tinswalo exists, how lucky did she have to be? And for every Tinswalo, how many others wouldn't have made it and why? Phelisa, can we start with you? How lucky? Do you recognize Tinswalo? And if so, how lucky was she?
Well, I do recognize Tintswalo, by the way. I mean, if you grew up in the TB states where you have to travel with a passport when you come to South Africa, and in the border of Queenstown to South Africa, you had to show off your ID before you can cross and come and see your parents, who are either working as domestic workers or working in the daily industry within the coastal region of the country, in this context, Western Cape. And when you arrive in there, they live in a hostel. There's absolutely no sense of dignity in their lifestyles, but also they are also limited in terms of movement. So post-democratic dispensation, you will find Tinswalo, because any child that is born post-1994 or during the democratic dispensation, they have a lot more better freedom than we had. I think that's the first thing. Of course, it's true that when we then talk about a Tinswalo in a pool of between 66.8% or 70% of younger people who are not only socially disengaged, but also economically disengaged, the story of Tinswalo become, a drop in the ocean. I think the third issue, of course, is that in a class society, right, where, for instance, if you are a product of a working class family, with in this context, your parents are domestic workers or they are gardeners, etc., and you're not likely to actually have opportunities to go to university. And I think most of the younger children depend on the social security, so there's very little to share, because in essence, how your class position as a family and how that influence access to both social capital, but also as well as university, kind of like really determines both your social and economic progress.
So can I jump in and just say, so yeah. She's a drop in the ocean. Tinswalo is a drop in the ocean, to use your words, Phelisa. The question is, how small is the drop and how big is the ocean? And I don't know, Khwezi, if you want to come in, but it is not inevitable that Tinswalo should be such a small drop in such a large ocean. This is the point, I think. Because if you look at Europe after the Second World War, if you look at the Asian tigers, if you look at China, if you look at Brazil, there are instances in which millions of people have managed to improve their quality of life in a small period of time. It's what the ANC government set out to do when I was in the presidency in 1994. So the question is, how small a drop is Tinswalo in how big an ocean, and why? Khwezi, what figures do we need to make sense of that?
Yeah, so let me first start off by just saying that I'm not an economist, but I'm a development sociologist, but I have an interest in political economy. So for me, I think when we look at Tinswalo, we have to look at some of the key indicators around development since 1994, and then take the debate forward from then on. So, for example, we know that there's been improvements in terms of access to basic services. We know that a significant portion of our population has had access to social grants and other social security measures that have impacted people's livelihoods. But we also know that we're dealing with systemic and intergenerational inequality as well. So for me, I would argue that there are Tinswalos in South Africa, but it's a mixed bag of results depending on the indicators that you're looking at, and that's how I would approach the the debate or discussion on whether it's sufficient or not.
And that's where I want to come in here, that we seem to have an impulse for using the lowest common denominator, the most desperate of circumstances, whether people could move freely. Of course, they couldn't during apartheid, but surely we ought to just be a little bolder and a little ambitious and not necessarily compare ourselves right now to what our parents went through. What we need to do is make an assessment based on the resources that were available at our disposal post-1994. My question would be, did we do enough with what we had at the time that democracy died? Did we do enough with what we had at the time that we were enjoying a 3% economic growth? Because surely a society should not regress. Always comparing South Africa to the apartheid days. Of course, the current and the present will always win because we are using the most crass of standards that were bequeathed to Black people. But with where democracy was meant to take us, did we do enough with the tools at our disposal? What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're correct, by the way, is that our constitution actually sets the standards. But I was just building on the Tinswalo notion, though. It sets the standard in that it commits itself on Section 9 of the Constitution that it will build an equitable society where citizens have equal access, not only to resources, but also to basic services, but as well as economic opportunities. So that's the yardstick unto which we measure. So then when you integrate 80% of citizens into the mainstream economy, but of course, if the framework unto which you use to integrate, or in fact, let me say, the framework unto which you use to meet your constitutional obligation is also skewed, you're not going to be able to do enough. So let me make a simple example. So, for instance, in the democratic dispensation, one of the key things we've seen massively happening is the economic migration, meaning that imposing the very same what you call dysfunctionality amongst African families. So when we've seen migration during in the 1800s and 1900s, where Black men were taken out of their families to come and support the growth of the mining sector, it meant that women were left behind to raise the children. And no one to date has really begun to talk about the social consequences of having families that are raised by women alone when their fathers are working in the city. But then let's fast track and talk about post-1994. So post-1994, if you then talk about the constitution that promotes equitable rights and access to economic opportunities, why do we still have a situation where, in fact, provinces like Eastern Cape has lost between 2.6 million, 3.1 citizens that are spread across in Gauteng, in Western Cape, and as well as KZN, looking for economic opportunities. So with this long narrative, Redi, I'm trying to answer your question that we actually, our intervention has also been quite minimal. What makes it quite minimal is the fact that we've trapped South African economy into a structural constraint, perpetuating the very intergenerational inequality that Khwezi refers to. Amongst those is the fact that we've borrowed an economic framework and as well as a development a policy framework that does not speak to the paradigm of South Africa.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the economic framework, Phelisa. Sorry to jump in. When I was in the presidency, we had the Reconstruction and Development Program. When Thabo Mbeki closed the RDP office that I was in, we moved to the gear policy. Then there was Eskisa, then there were a few others. And what did that mean? Did it mean that we stopped putting the money that we needed to into the programs that would have benefited potential Tinswalos? I think this is the question, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves and try and answer. I think we built something in the region of 60,000 to 100,000 houses per year, just to use housing as an example. And I think the backlog was 1.6 million. And I think the backlog increased over some years because of all the people who entered South Africa, because of population growth, because of, you know, normal processes of increasing need of housing. So I don't think that the money that we put into some of those social programs, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's health, were sufficient to address the backlogs we were trying to address. It's like we're chasing a cat chasing its tail on housing. You know, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. We still seem to have 2.something million, 2.3 million, you know, people in need of housing in 2024, when it was 1.6 million in 1994, and we're delivering some houses each year, better than not delivering any. Khwezi, have we turned away from economic policies that are redistributive?
Well, I think the reality is that I think at the beginning of democracy, there was a lot of focus on just growth and attracting investment and creating a conducive environment and underpinning that with a level of extensive social security programs. But that only produced certain positive results. You had the high growth, but you didn't deal sufficiently with the question of inequality. And I think this is something that we need to look at and revisit, especially when we look at areas like social policy, especially when we look at areas such as corporate tax, and other forms of structural inequality that we need to address even in the economy and in markets. So I would agree that there were some incorrect policy choices that were made for addressing inequality sufficiently. And we need to focus on that. There was too much of an emphasis on just growth, attracting investment, and just macroeconomic stability indicators such as debt to GDP ratio.
And what about stuffing the money under the mattress, spiriting the money away for your friends, the Guptas? Redi, we were having this conversation the other day. I mean, do you think the problem is the policies, or that, you know, politicians and leaders were not even focused on the policies that they had been talking about?
And just to add on that, you know, it's very difficult to persuade South Africans that these structural issues are insurmountable, they are untenable, because inevitably you would compare the money being lost to poor governance, to corruption, the money that often has to return to Treasury because we haven't created the right attitude and the right framework for expenditure. So South Africans don't believe that we don't have money for development and progress, just to add to what Ben has said.
Yeah, and there's a thing about capacity, you know. Okay, go in, Phelisa.
Okay, let's let them speak.
So, I mean, I just think that for me, the starting point, by the way, is that we just need to interrogate just the development paradigm we've presented South Africans with. So if I follow, for example, Ben, your thought process around the housing, right? So on average, we know African families have between 5 to 8 family members. I mean, there's data in them. But then if we deliver RDP houses that just present with 1 bedroom, a toilet and an open plan sitting room, exactly what are we presenting to South African as part of development paradigm? I think that's a issue. So as long as you have that mismatch in relation to what you seek to address and versus what the crisis. So if your problem statement you're not clear about and versus what you seek to address, we are always going to have that misnomer. That's the first thing. I think the second issue that we need to look at is the fact that we're spending 59.2% of South Africa's GDP on social policy, and we're spending 7.8% on industrial development. And part of the point I was making is that as long as our allocation of resources is skewed towards, spending on social policy, and what at first value might appear quite redistributive, because the government is actually providing, free education, free healthcare, but also as well as cash transfers to those who are likely to have are not able to be absorbed by the labor market, or they're in the informal sector. And the key question is that by spending 59.2% of the GDP on social policy, what type of society are we really engineering, right? Because one of the key issues is that a democratic government who has inherited a deindustrializing economy in 1994, you would expect that actually they should be spending more money to particularly deal with structural inequality, to deal with intergenerational inequality, but also fundamentally to deal with the point I was making around the social consequences of breaking up African families, where, for instance, now a lot of families are actually living in informal settlement in the cities while they're building decent homes in the rural communities. And they only spend 1 month, 11 months, they live in informal settlement. So immediately, that sends a very clear message that there is a misnomer in the thinking and, in fact, in terms of what type of a developmental policy should be designing for South African. South Africa.
Let me bring you in here. You've argued previously that we need to move away from this kind of market-led socio-economic program, and that we need to look at socio-economic programs and interventions as an investment rather than simply a burden on the tax-based, diverging from market-led development model. The ANC will tell you, the ANC government will tell you that that's exactly what they are doing, that you can't ignore the real pressure of managing debt, managing inflation, and so on. But through the school feeding scheme, healthcare, no-fee schools, all of that, and of course the debate now about the universal BIG, that this is exactly what the ANC is doing. So are we saying it's not yielding results?
It's not yielding the results because there's a de-link between social policy and industrial policy. So, for example, if you're going to build houses, I mean, you look at the stats, they'll say that 80% of South Africans live in formal dwellings right now. You've got to ask questions around, is that social policy intervention linked to programs like localization and industrialization in order to create more value in the economy? So for me, it's not about whether you do either social policy or industrial policy. It's a question about linking them in a way that you produce more developmental outcomes. So similarly, if 18 million South Africans are getting grants, why are they spending that money in the same retail market that is concentrated, right? That is based on a particular industrialized agro-food system? Why aren't we leveraging that social policy to restructure the food system and the agricultural sector so that to diversify it and to deal with structural inequality? So for me, the argument would be that, yes, the ANC is introducing the social policy programs, but the link between those programs and restructuring the economy is not sufficient, and that's why they're not producing the desired results. The other point that I also want to make is that I think that the overemphasis on these market indicators, so like GDP, the level of debt that you have, and FDI and the likes, they're good for your macroeconomic sort of analysis, but they don't really translate into changing livelihoods. And so for me, that's why I think we need to shift how we even measure development in society, and not just use those indicators, because we have experienced high levels of growth before, and it didn't produce the socioeconomic impact that we want. The other thing is that we're not going to also undo the structural inequality that we're trying to address without sufficient state intervention. The evidence is clear globally that you do need a legitimate state intervention and redistributive policies to address the structural inequality that South Africa is facing. Yeah.
And now we're in the worst case scenario. Phelisa wants us to move away from, spending almost 60% of our money on social expenditure. But we haven't created the job markets, the employment, the industrial, growth that would mean that we can absorb all those people into a labor market and that they've got jobs and livelihoods. So it's wishful thinking, hey, Phelisa, that we can suddenly, it's like we missed the opportunity. This is back to Tintswalo. We said we were going to create Tinswalos. We said we were going to invest the money in all of the social programs, and then they would have all the jobs and get absorbed into the labor market. Somewhere we lost our nerve. Somewhere we missed our opportunity. Somewhere we were too busy chowing the resources. We're joined by Pali Lehohla, our former statistician general. I occasionally have referred to you as Mr. Statistics Africa, because if anybody knows the statistics in this country and this continent, it is you. Are you there? Can you join us? Can you tell us? Tinswalo, how lucky would you have had to be a Tinswalo?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and joining. It looks like I'm joining more than once. I hope it is not creating problems for us.
Statistically speaking, it's fine. Statistically, there's only that we only see one of you. The other one the other one is a standard deviation of yourself.
I thought there was an exception on my screen being a Tinswalo. Let me talk a bit about Tinswalo. That a Tinswalo is a metaphor, of course, and a metaphor in the current of the average, or what you get as an ordinary South African moving up in a particular way. And metaphors are crucial for representation. But metaphors, when they are not representative, that they don't reflect the numbers, then really they become unuseful. You can't use an exception as a metaphor. So,
but it's a nice exception. It's such a nice exception. It's a beautiful life story, you know. I mean, are you saying that there are many, 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 many more non-Tinswalos than there are Tinswalos? Is that what you're saying?
Now you have asked the question more direct. And the origins of a Tinswalo or a Tinswalo of sorts coming in the National Development Plan, and Trevor Manuel elaborates this in his voice over when he talks about the challenges as they are, and comes up with Thandi. And in his conclusion, he says, Thandi will only see some money when she reaches the age of 65. That's when she will receive 60, because for women, it's 60. That's when she will get income. So here was a typical Tinswalo. And that Tinswalo was based on the census of 2001. That showed the reality of men in South Africa, the challenge, and therefore what it will take through the NDP to resolve that. And then the NDP goes on to say how many doctors, how many this we'll have to create. Unfortunately, the NDP itself was just it's a document that has not been respected by anyone. It's been a document that really has not been followed through. It's a document.
Why is that? Why is that, Dr. Lehohla? Why is that, though? Because I remember when it was launched, you know, we have NDP, we have this and that. There was a lot of energy in the country. But the reality is that we are seeing the continuities of high unemployment, low growth. And in one interview, I heard you say last year that South Africa has reversed democratic gains in the last 15 years. I was struck by that you didn't say in the last 30 years, you said in the last 15 years, which means that I'm concluding that you are implying that there was a time where our trajectory was positive, where it seemed like we were going to birth many Thandis or Lerato or Tinswalos or so on. So in the last 15 years, what is so unique about our planning? What is so unique about our implementation that it has reversed the democratic gains, in your view?
I'll answer that by continuing the Tinswalo story or the Lerato story. Because in the census of 2011, we created Enyo Lerato Tandi. And their conditions reflected a more challenging situation, both in terms of education, the family in which they are, and so on. And that was an average family in the census. And in 2016, we extended that by saying these people are now 5 years older. What is happening? So when you create a Tinswalo or a Lerato, you have to pick up from the data, from the evidence, an average person, because then that becomes representative of the conditions and the challenges. The question we're asking is, why is that? It's not why are we choosing an average person, but rather what is the situation and why are we not, given that the NDP was actually accommodated and accepted by so many people. It was true that in Parliament, the highest law-making body in the country, across all party lines, accepted the NDP.
So we need you to answer the question as well as asking the question. Paddy, we need to know what we failed to spend on, what we failed to keep our eye on. But first of all, I'm going to push you on that thing of how untypical was Tinswalo. So you said you got to pick an average. Tinswalo is not the average. So I want to know how far from the average she was. When we talked previously, you once said about 1.2 million South Africans are born every year. Did I get that right? So if that's the case,
yes, indeed.
How many of them might become a Tinswalo? Just averagely, because if Mr. Statistic doesn't know, nobody's going to know. We need to know how many Tinswalos have we been creating per year on average, roughly, so we know how untypical she is.
1.2 million children are born in South Africa every year. By the time they write matric, only 700,000 of those will write matric. Of those, only 250 will get a decent pass that says they've completed. They have a certificate, a school living certificate that is decent. So what it means is that 900,000 are less likely to get any better. And now, you see that numbers of unemployed, unemployable in the age groups 25 to 34, as well as age groups 15 to 24. So that is the cumulative effect, that failure.
So Tinswalo by then, sorry, go on, Redi.
Okay, carry on. You
I was going to say Tinswalo.
I want to bring Khwezi in on something else, yeah?
100%. So Tinswalo is 1 in 5 maybe by the time of matric. And then we heard from, at university, as many as 45 to I think about 50% of students drop out in the first year of university for many, many different reasons, including transport, funding, many things, hunger. So by then, Tinswalo, if Tinswalo made it all the way through university, and in fact, I think Tinswalo not only makes it to university, but either gets a really good job or gets, government funding for her business, she would by that time be like 1 in 10 or 1 in 12 or something?
Well, it will be less than 1 in 10. 1 in 10 will be 100,000, even the 1.2 million. It is far less than that. You will be looking at about 20,000. Let me make it more dramatically. In terms of just progression and success, for every one black person that went to university and succeeded in the 80s, there would have been 1.2 whites who would have succeeded as a proportion, not in the absolute numbers, because the absolute numbers have changed quite dramatically from 5,000 to 100,000. But absolute numbers are meaningless unless you put them as proportions in order to understand what progress is being made. As we speak now, for every one black person who succeeds, there are 6 whites who succeed. And that is a reflection of a reversal of progress amongst black people, even though in absolute numbers, they've become a little bit more. So a typical Tintswalo will be far less than 1 in 10. it is more like 1 in 30.
Let's talk about Tintswalo in the context of the social security system. You know, it's very hard for me to listen to debates around the basic income grant, universal basic income grant, social security. It's very hard for me to have those conversations with people who believe that having more South Africans in the system is a sign of failure. It's a sign that our economy is not growing. It's a sign that indigent people are increasing. I mean, when the president stands and boasts about the number of people who are on grants, you hear the counter voices saying that's not anything to be happy about. I have a bit of a tension with that, because even in countries like the United States, when they were debating whether to discontinue AGOA and PEPFAR for South Africa, and they talk about the basic income grant, that it's creating dependency, there is no society in the 21st century that should be proud of not taking care of the desperately poor. We need societies that care. We need societies that recognize that we've got enough resources to take care of the poor. But having said that, the question then arises, what is the right look, the right picture when it comes to the social security system? I mean, if we've got 18 million beneficiaries, that half households rely on grants, and they use grants for food and transport. I mean, that's saving lives and ensuring that people do not fall through the cracks. So what should be South Africa's conversation around the social security system? Does expanding it inadvertently mean that we are a failing society, or is it a sign of a functional and caring democracy? I'm going to bring you in here, Khwezi, and then we'll hear from Dr. Lehohla and Phelisa as well. Khwezi?
Yeah. So the first thing is that we have structural unemployment, and as long as we have structural unemployment, it means that there are no jobs. So the idea that people are lazy to work and that's why they don't get jobs, for me, it doesn't hold water. As long as we have structural unemployment, we will need a level of social security. And the other point is that we must also move away from this notion that social security is unproductive, because when people spend the money that they get from social transfer, it creates demand in the economy, and that's good for economic development. The other point I also want to make is that you could potentially use the social security system to even restructure certain markets, like I made example about the food system. If you move it away from the dependency on this established retail and the agro-industrial food system, and you tie that expenditure to reorientating our food system, that's another way where you can actually link social policy more to development and industrial diversification. So for me, if we expand it, it actually shows that we're functioning democracy, and that we cannot see social security as wasteful expenditure. Last point on this is that not everyone is going to be absorbed in the formal labor market in a capitalist system. People are working outside of formal labor markets, and they're actually using some portion of that social transfer funds to assist them to pursue those livelihoods. So we must not also be narrow when we think about the links between social security, development, jobs, and livelihoods. Yeah. So those would be my responses.
Phelisa, what do you think of this? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree, by the way, that it's important to provide safety nets for citizens who are quite vulnerable. But I just want to make one quick example. Firstly, one of the things from a fiscal expansion perspective that has happened is that we've not been spending on capital formation in this context on infrastructure. So there's one example I normally just share. In 2019, we had 100,000 people who were not drawing their social grant. And those people were located in the Port St. John's area, Kokstad, Port Edward, right up until closer to Durban. And one of the things that we started doing research about, we actually realized that they were actually earning an income that was much more better than the social security. So obviously, what is the strong indicator? The indicator is that if the state is able to spend on capital formation in the form of building infrastructure or maintaining infrastructure, and people can secure a job, in essence, you can actually move them out of social security so that they're able to lead decent lives, but also provide much more safety nets for their own children. That's the second issue. I think the third issue is that I agree with Khwezi that the fact that we continue to delink our social security spending to actually industrial development will always remain the leakage in the economy. So amongst the key things, of course, while social security creates a demand in the South African economy, the biggest issue is the fact that our economy is actually, there's oligopolies and monopolies within various sectors of the economy. So meaning that you have families who are just, I mean, for example, the agro sector, if I make an example, it's actually controlled by 8 firms in South Africa, right? Out of 62.4 million South Africans. So, I mean, that, and I think that oligopolistic organized agro sector means that it's actually an extraction in the economy. 85% of South Africans, before they cook, they walk into a supermarket, right? Meaning that it's only 15% who actually have either gardens or they can walk into their farm and feed themselves. And part of it is that you can't therefore delink the question of access to land, but also as well as social security. So in essence, and I think when I spoke about our development paradigm, as long as our development paradigm takes on a linear approach in how it actually intervenes, we are always going to have minimal results. In this context, you have 18 million people who sit in the social grant, and all they do is just to spend the money on both food and transport. But in fact, if you actually trigger other aspects around policy, I'm talking about land policy, I'm talking about business support, right? I mean, you have more than 2.8 million people who are in the informal sector who absolutely don't get any form of support. And you have small, medium enterprises who are still even struggling to have access through a public procurement system, because our public procurement system is extremely conservative, very linear, as well as very exclusive.
So I think we're all saying the same thing. I think we want the same outcome, which is that we want Khwezi not to have to rely, Khwezi, we want Tinswalo not to have to rely, sorry, Khwezi.
It can be Khwezi too, it's fine. There's Thandi, there's Lerato, there's Khwezi, there's Tintswalo, there's Redi, you know.
You know, so we want this person, this imaginary person. You know, we were talking before the podcast about how these rather older male politicians keep inventing young women that somehow are supposed to prove or disprove their promises, their record, and so on. Strange reality that we live in of these male politicians inventing young women. They should have real people who do or don't prove their theories. But we want the same thing. We want a society in which Tintswalo has employment or a livelihood, is not necessarily dependent on the state. But we can't get there without a welfare state that provides the goods and the services that allow people to live productive lives as part of the economy. And, you know, if you look around the world, I grew up in Britain, you know, at the end of the 20th century. And if you even go back to the Industrial Revolution, there was no Industrial Revolution without a welfare state. There was no big growth push anywhere in the world without a state that was there providing housing, healthcare, education. The point at which those things were needed, the state had to step in and provide all those things. So you need that expenditure in order to get people to the stage where they can be economically productive. And this is where I agree with Redi. Having a really well-functioning welfare state is not a sign of failure, it's a sign of success. So I want to come back to Dr. Pali Lehohla and ask, did we follow through on our commitments on health and education and all of those things? We created some Tinswalos. Did we spend enough money? If not, why not? Or are there other reasons in terms of the distraction of our politicians, you know, with chowing resources or whatever else they've been busy with in the last 10, 15, 20 years that have stopped us from having really well-functioning education, health, housing policies that have reached more people?
Well, I think if you look at the numbers, if you look into the numbers from 96 to about 2001 to 2008, you could see actually a lot of progress being achieved in as far as expanding the social, what one would call a social wage, electricity, water, sanitation, and all those. We saw a lot of improvement in that space, including achievement in terms of enrollment and completion rates at matric. They were still low by any standard because we have got stuck at that low level of only 700,000 managing to write, but only 250,000. So what is the formula of jacking this up beyond where we are? It's simply to look at the macroeconomic policies. That should then jack the situation beyond where we were with social grants, which means increase employment at all levels. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation that we are at the moment, whereby in 2008, we had 4.8 million people who are aged between 25 to 34 who were employed. That is in 2008. Today is 2023. That number has dropped to 4.6 million in a growing population over that period. It's worse for those who are 15 to 24 because there were 1.6 million that were employed in 2008. Today it's only 1 million. The only spaces where growth is happening in employment is when you are about 35. So it suggests that there are major mistakes or major policy faults that we have engaged in that have actually destroyed that trajectory that we're almost making way towards. It's gotten worse because now we don't have electricity, we don't have rail. Gross fixed capital formation, which is what Nkomo is talking about, on how do we invest in infrastructure. We have not only deindustrialized, but we have also removed investment in infrastructure. That which existed, we have destroyed. The net effect of that economic activity or economic muscle on the social arrangements is that we have lost everything. No rail, no electricity, no water, deplorable health conditions, and all these things demand and require that there has to be a cushion on those that get affected the worst. But some of these things are things that are self-inflicted, unfortunately. So we are in that kind of space. Coming back to the issue of food security, we don't have food security in South Africa. We have food surpluses, but that doesn't guarantee any food security. That is the amount of food that we require in South Africa as a nation. And the amount that is produced, what we produce is much more than what we require. But it is those monopolies that produce this, that deprive everybody else of any meaningful growing of gardens and so on. Eastern Cape. I was going through the census. Suddenly I come across Mbashe in this area. Old ladies, elderly, but this village or this community has the highest intensity of agricultural activity. They are pensioners. You can be sure that the social grants that they were having, those social grants, and allocated them in their farming activities. So when I got to Mbashe, the maize leaf was that big. The cocks and the chickens were doing their own thing and producing eggs. And you could see that these are livelihoods that are meaningful. Now, no sooner has the pension been paid, it is back at Checkers and it's back in Johannesburg.
And that's not a government. That's not a government policy that makes it possible for those women in Mbashe to have cocks and chickens running around and producing enough eggs. That's their initiative, presumably on the ground. But they needed the support of government, that they were not starving, that they had, some basics there, which we had to keep going in order to create more and more places in the country where people could sort of do their own thing. But we do need to break up the stranglehold that Phelisa was talking about earlier of these large corporations owned by a few families who dominate food, who dominate mining, who dominate everything still, just like they did in 1994. I mean, if you want to create Tinswalos, you've got to take something away from the people who own too much, who control too much, that prevent Tinswalo from being an entrepreneur, from being a employee rising up through the ranks and growing something, because everything's controlled by a few families still in South Africa. Hey, Redi?
And just to what, and it goes to what Phelisa was saying about the social grants, that it ought to be used to enable exactly what Dr. Lehohla is talking about. But also for me, there's a way in which this also speaks to the agency amongst the poor. Nobody wants to be poor. And that's why this whole conversation around dependency really makes me mad, because I can tell you right now, with the right tools, people want to do things for themselves. If we have this anti-competitive behavior, and if we have this really debilitating culture of wealth creation to the detriment of all others, then we kind of cutting our nose to spite our face. But I wonder, Khwezi, what your thoughts are. Do you have some harsh words for the private sector as well? How responsible is the private sector in that whole state of Tintswalo being trunk, or the other Tinswalos not being able to progress? Because sometimes we also get into this conversation that doesn't take us anywhere, where it's the public sector versus the private sector. But I'm kind of speaking to a whole culture of doing business in South Africa. Is it helpful?
So the one thing is that whenever we speak about corruption, we must definitely also highlight this link between the public and the private. And in fact, that it's been proven through various studies and investigations of the Competition Commission that there's collusion in the private sector, there's profit shifting that's taking on, and other sort of anti-developmental activities that are undertaken by big corporations that undermine our ability to basically invest in producing a more beneficial outcome for society at large. And that's the first thing that I wanted to highlight. But also, two, even if you look at issues around transformation in the private sector, whether you look at especially when you look at issues related to race and age, it's clear that the private sector is lagging behind when you look at those issues in terms of the demographics, and that's another important point that I think we need to factor in. And then the third thing is that we have to come back to this relationship between the state and the private sector. The private sector will never voluntarily just engage in activities that produce outcomes that are not just about ensuring their returns on investment or just profit. You need a capable state that creates sort of regulatory mechanisms and incentives and can hold the private sector accountable to produce outcomes that benefit the public good rather than just narrow profit seeking. So those would be my 3 points. And my view is that, especially on the last point, we've really failed in that regard.
Yeah, it's not enough.
Can I just build? I mean, particularly on the capable state component. I mean, one of the things that is still very unclear in South Africa, it's how the economic architecture is organized. In this context, where does government really drive the private sector to actually invest in? Because as long as, for instance, there's no clarity between government, from a government perspective, that actually we see rail as a strategic sector for South Africa, because it's not only about creating jobs, but also contributing in advancing technology, but also it's about moving goods, right? So, I mean, right under our watch, you would see how dilapidated the rail infrastructure has been, both from a passenger perspective as well as goods. Now, if we had a very clear vision in relation to rail, I'm not just going to stick to rail for the sake of this conversation, and there could be a lot more water, you go on. And as long as government is actually just not clear about what it seeks to achieve, what private sector is going to do, it's going to do a cherry picking, which that's what we've been doing in South Africa. In that we've seen that cherry picking through the fact that private sector has actually kept their financial reserves at more than 1.5 trillion, actually, as of late last year, not spending the money in the economy. Of course, part of it has to do with the fact that we have, they are worried about the political instability, but also the other one is the fact that actually, if you look at how we raise the debt in the financial market. We pay 9%, and the reason we're paying 9% when you raise money in the financial market, because obviously we raise it within the private sector, had to do with the fact that they've been saying we've had perpetual low growth in South Africa, and so therefore there's no confidence that there's a very clear strategic thinking about how to take South African economy from low growth to high growth, right? So already, I mean, the type of premium that we're starting to pay as a result of a clear industrial planning is actually massive. And there's just a lack of recognition that as long as we don't direct private sector around where it needs to invest. The last point I want to make, I don't know if any of you take the time to attend the investment conference. I mean, I now and again participate in. I mean, you know, private sector company just come up and, you know, highlight the investment programs. But when you look in terms of the intangible terms, because then you must be able to measure some of the investments announced at that investment conference versus very simple, the GDP growth. I mean, we've been growing. The investment conference started for almost 4 years now. But instead, our growth trajectory has really been on the decline from 1.1% to 0.6% of GDP. So if there was a real investment that was taking place, directed by the state and also fundamentally supported by both macroeconomic policy in this context, fiscal policy and monetary policy, would actually been very far. And at the peak of declining growth, we are choked with interest rate increases. So you can imagine, of course, what that means, because the signal we're sending the market that we're actually confused about what we want to achieve.
Thanks, Phelisa. I'm often hesitant to talk to economists. I used to say I only studied economics so I could argue with the high priests of economics. Study the scriptures so you can argue with the priests. But I think we've learned quite a bit here. We've learned that we failed to get to grips with the ownership of the South African economy. We failed to use all of the resources that we could have used, and we've taken our eye off the ball. And as Paddy told us, you know, Tinswalo is probably 1 in 30. Maybe by the end of her life, she may be 1 in 50 or 1 in 100. So it's great to be able to celebrate that we've done something, but we failed to restructure the economy so that there can be opportunities for most South Africans. Redi, Tinswalo is an illusion.
Tintswalo is an illusion. She's the exception. And as Dr. Pali Lehohla told us, that you don't use the exception to claim a particular part of reality. And I am thinking, Ben, as we were talking about all the many people that I went to school with in Soweto, I still go to Soweto quite a lot, and you see a whole lot of them having made progress, but others making progress against all odds, and a life that is full of strife, that is full of hardships, when with the right resources, the right intentions, the political will, we would be far. I mean, I saw, Ben, the government, some government spokespeople and even the government boasting about improvements to our electricity supply. But then you read another report that says, well, the reason we haven't had load shedding and the reason there's been some marginal improvement is because people are investing in solar energy. Now we have a crisis of water. I was in Johannesburg recently, and I'm still on my neighborhood WhatsApp group, and there are problems of water. People are digging boreholes. You don't want this kind of parallel state. You don't want this kind of situation where people are only finding solutions in the private sector, because it simply means that if you don't have the money, then you're not going to get the resources. But it also means that a whole section of your population is checking out of the public service. And I don't think that out of public services, and I don't think that that is a good thing, Ben. I'm also thinking about the unemployment rate standing at an elevated, 32.4% in 2023, with women and youth persistently more impacted. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm looking to these elections, and I know that we're not going to get the answer come the 30th of May, but I want to get as close as possible to that answer. Are we wrapping up, Ben?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Phelisa, Nkomo, Khwezi, Mabasa,
thank you very
Dr.
much,
Pali
Dr. Khwezi
Lehohla.
Mabasa.
Thank you so much. We are going to continue to talk about economics, politics, and everything else in South Africa and the world on Reality Check. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.